So I don't know about you, but nobody likes to be on the receiving end of lying, right? I don't know if there's anybody that's like, I love it when somebody lies to me. We have 2 kids. They're older now, 24 and 22 years old now. But when they were growing up, even if it happened now, I hope it wouldn't. But when they were growing up, there are a lot of things as a parent that you can tolerate with your kids. But one of the things that I hated as a parent is when your kids would look in your face, and because as a parent, you know all things, and you know when your kids are lying to you, but they still have the audacity to look you in the face and say something that you know is a lie, and they will defend it until the last moment that you wear them down. Nobody likes being lied to. But even as adults, we like to justify our own lies by deceiving ourselves sometimes into thinking that our lies are helpful. You know, we're just helping someone by lying. And I think one of the biggest reasons maybe we lie is lie to control outcomes. We like to soften consequences or avoid unwanted reactions to any given circumstance. Here are a couple ways that we lie. We'll start out with something simple that everybody here has probably done. I know we have relatively perfect people here at the summit, but I guarantee you've done this one. If you have a job, I'm certain you've done this one. Exaggerating small inconveniences to justify why we've done what we've done. You ever showed up at work late and you feel like, I need to explain myself? It was like, traffic. Yeah, like what kind of traffic? Like there was a dog or a cat in your driveway and you had to wait for like 1 second. We like to kind of exaggerate those type of things. These small inconveniences to justify why we've done what we've done. Another way is minimizing personal problems that we all have to avoid burdening other people. We sometimes refer to these as white lies to spare somebody else their feelings about our circumstance. Or how about this? You know, I would say of all of these lies that I'm really good at, this would be at the top. And this is one that we'll talk about in depth today as we jump into Genesis chapter 12. Not disclosing full information to protect our privacy. In other words, a half-truth. It's not that we're lying, but we're not telling the full truth with hopes that half-truth will be enough to control an outcome. But I think with the introduction of social media, which by the way has not been we haven't had that around very long, but it definitely, it's a good and a bad thing. But we've learned to create a facade of happiness even when we're struggling. Essentially presenting a version of ourselves that isn't entirely true. Because you can do that online. You can create a version of yourself that everybody sees online that you know in reality is not who you really are. For some of you, it's just the highlight reel of your life, and it leaves conveniently out many of the difficulties that you face. I think ultimately lying shows that we don't trust another person with the truth. I mean, isn't that what it is? When we decide that we're going to lie to someone, we're saying to them, I don't trust you with the full truth. Lying, let me just say this up front, is never okay. And today we're going to see how our lies, or specifically the lie of Abram, affects other people. But also how a lie calls into question whether God can help us work through hardship. Now, last week we started looking at the life or the story of Abram, and I'll refer to him a lot interchangeably, Abram, Abraham, same person, but later on in the story, as we walk into this in a couple months, we're going to see that his name is changed to fit the promises that God has made to him. But what we discovered last week about Abraham is, first of all, that he grew up in a pagan household. It wasn't like he came from a household where God was like, hey, you're doing amazing things, you're being obedient, you're following me, so I'm coming to you and I'm telling you these things, I'm making you these promises because you're just knocking it out of the park. That's not why God came and made these promises to Abraham. In fact, it had nothing to do with his own goodness at all. It was just simply out of God's graciousness and sovereign choice. And we discovered that he was also married to a woman named Sarai, and later on her name will be called Sarah, who was not able to have children. It's the only thing that we learned at the tail end of Genesis chapter 11 about her, which sounds terrible, right? If the first thing that you learn about somebody is that they didn't have a child, especially in this culture, the fact that she didn't have a child in this culture would have meant that people looked down on her. And then we see that God spoke. This is what we learned last week, that God spoke to him, spoke to Abram, and he made 3 promises. And at this time, he was 75 years old. Abram lived to 175 years old, so he wasn't even at midlife yet. Again, this was a different time. I don't know if you would love to live to 175, but I'm 50, and my back hurts enough to say, I don't think I can make it to 175 years old with a back like mine. But he was 75 years old, and God comes to Abram, and he makes 3 promises to him. And again, if you're a guest or something here, by the way, if you are a guest, welcome. But if you go to church, if you've been to church here a while, you should know these promises. We talk about these all the time. And the reason that we talk about these all the time is because they're intimately linked into the entirety of the story of the Bible, okay? So there were 3 promises, and I'm gonna make you, if you go to church here, again, if you're a guest, listen to the person sitting beside you that maybe invited you or that you're here with, and if they don't like say this loud, then you judge them for not knowing these things. They should know these things, okay? If you're a guest, just sit back and listen to the people around you, okay? So 3 promises. Number 1 was land. Number 2, nation. Number 3, blessing. Those are the 3 promises. God came to Abram and he said, these are the 3 things I'm gonna do to you. I'm gonna give you land. I'm gonna make of you a nation. And then I'm going to bless you. Through you, all families of the earth will be blessed. And we discover, as we talked about last week, that blessing was not a multiple blessing per se, but the blessing ultimately was Christ, meaning that the deliverer that was promised in Genesis 3:15, that God promised Adam and Eve that he would send someone to deliver them from their sin, this offspring would come through the line of Abraham. So when he says that, when he promises this blessing is that all families of the earth will be blessed through him, but ultimately this blessing was Christ, who was born to pay the penalty for sins. So what we're discovering here, and as we walk into the story a little bit further, is we want to latch onto these 3 promises that God said, I'm going to give you a land, I'm going to give you a nation, and through you, I'm going to bless the whole world. But the problem is, so far, Abram owned nothing land-wise. He had no nation connected to him. He only had a small family. He had a wife that couldn't have any children. And this blessing, well, there wasn't really much to bless other people with. And what we're discovering is that when God makes a promise, what happens not only with Abram, as we'll see clearly today, but what happens with us also is that doubt doesn't usually surround whether he can do it, whether God can do it. Again, maybe that's just me, but my hang up is never whether or not God can do something. But the biggest thing I struggle with is how he'll do it, when he'll do it, or even if he will. I know he has the ability to do things, but will he end up doing it? Will Abraham trust God to fulfill these promises, even though circumstances are often confusing and difficult? Or will Abram fall victim to the following? Things like plans and purposes, meaning that God isn't bound by our desired outcomes. Our timing. God doesn't operate on our timeline. Sometimes we pray and we're like, God, by tomorrow, I need you to get me somebody to marry. We give those deadlines, right? Or God, I need this by next month or next year. We give a timeline and we say, God, I want you to do this. God doesn't operate on our timelines. Expectations. God doesn't respond in the way that we think he should. And then this is the one that's difficult, and we'll see this as this story unfolds, not just today, but as this story unfolds over the next couple months. But the thing that I think becomes very confusing in quote unquote doubting God is pain and suffering. And the biggest obstacle with this is that God's highest aim isn't to spare us hardships. And that's hard to say, right? Because nobody wants to stand in the difficulty or the hardship line. I don't know anybody, and there might be some people in here, I don't know, but I doubt there's anybody that's just praying, God, I love hardship so much. Please bring more into my life. I don't think anybody's really standing in that line. But God's highest aim isn't to spare us hardship. And in today's message, we're going to see that Abraham is going to face his first test in trusting God's promises to him, the land, the nation, and the blessing. Long term, those are the three things that God presented him with. I will do these things. But the difficulty enters in the short term when circumstances test what Abraham believes about God in the future. Because actions, not intentions, reveal who and what we believe. Regardless of what we intend to do, the steps we actually take expose our true heart. And what we'll clearly see is that Abraham was not chosen by God because he was perfect, but because God is gracious and always keeps promises he makes. When we ended last week, we saw that Abram was worshiping God based on these promises that God had made to him. But Abraham quickly forgets that his worship expressed trust. He forgot that his worship expressed trust that God would provide no matter the circumstances. So what we find is he was worshiping, he was thanking God for these promises, but that was long term. But short term, difficult circumstances entered into his life, and what we see is that there were some consequences that Abram experienced because he forgot about God's fulfillment of his promises, not just in the long term, but the short term. So it should be in Genesis chapter 12, and let's begin in verse 10. We only have 10 verses to go through today, and so that means a short message. That's a lie. No, we'll see. So remember this. Promises are made. Abram responds with worship. And then short-term circumstances enter in. Here's what happens. Now there was a famine in the land. So Abram went down to Egypt to sojourn there, for the famine was severe in the land. Now, I don't mean to make light of any of these things. If anybody's ever been hungry before, like, I'm not just talking about, man, I really could use a little Debbie cake right now. There's none in the cabinet. But I'm talking about legitimate hunger, a famine. This was severe. And Abram, in fact, I think we had this map that we put up last week. This will help us a little bit. I know I'm not expecting everybody to be able to read this at all unless you have amazing 20/20 vision. So this is where Abram was from. right? That's where he grew up in Ur. And Haran is where we see that they moved to. And then Canaan is over here. And that's right now where he's at. But however, what we see is that there was a famine here in this area. So he decided to go down here to Egypt. So just to kind of give you a reference, they started out here. They went to Haran. They were in Canaan. And now they're going to move down here to Egypt because there's a famine here in Canaan. So keep that in reference so you know exactly where we're at. This famine was severe. So what did Abraham do? He picks up his family and he goes to Egypt to find food. But here's what I want us to think about. Again, I'm going to repeat this over and over. So even if you've been going here like a week or two, you're going to know at least these things. Let's remind ourselves, God made Abraham a promise. And these promises were unconditional. He would, no matter if Abraham acted in disobedience, God was going to fulfill these promises through him. A land, a nation, and also a blessing. So thinking long-term about these promises, how does that affect the short term? If Abram believed that God was going to take care of him, if he was going to give him a land, if he was going to make of him a nation, and if he was also going to bless him through all nations of the earth, or all families of the earth would be blessed through him, then he should also believe that God would take care of him in the short term. So the question that we should ask ourselves is, wouldn't God provide for Abraham's need? Right? If there was a famine in this land of Canaan that God had clearly said, I'm going to give you this land, if there was a famine there, would God not provide for Abraham while he was there? You see, when circumstances are difficult, our first reaction is often to find another circumstance or location. Now, I need us to think through this because I'm speaking from my own experience. But when something's not going your way, the first response often is, I need to look for a new location, or I need to change my circumstances. Sometimes we'll even rearrange our lives so we can, by chance, control outcomes. We believe that new scenery means no new challenges or difficulty. Now, please don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying that there aren't times that God doesn't move us or doesn't shift our scenery or even our location. But I really believe that our first reaction to hardship or difficulty should not be, how far away can I get from this circumstance, but to examine where we're at in the circumstance to see whether it is God is testing our faith. You see, in our minds, it's easier to change direction rather than remain and trust God for the outcome based in what he had promised. So the question is, wouldn't God provide for Abraham's need? Because God had truly called him to Canaan and not Egypt. Wouldn't God also be faithful to provide? And that's the first thing we have to look at. The long-term promise was land, nation, blessing. But in the short term, Abraham was like, there's a famine in the land. I know God's going to give us this land of Canaan, but right now we need to take off and go someplace else so we can get food. He was taking things into his own hands. Well, it doesn't get any better, because something which I consider kind of crazy happens here. And just put this in the back of your mind, because this is going to happen again. And then if you read on through Genesis, this happens again with another member, descendant of the family. So this is a repeated action over and over. Look in verse 11. When he, speaking of Abraham, was about to enter Egypt, he said to Sarai, his wife, and this is great, this is the best thing he could have ever said. I know that you are a woman beautiful in appearance. Listen, if you're married or engaged or something like that, it's always great for your wife or your fiance to hear those words. You are beautiful in appearance. But you know, if your husband or your fiance says that, they're probably next words out of their mouth are probably going to be something like asking for something, and that's exactly what happens here. This is what Abraham does. So he says, I know you're stunning. Verse 12. And when the Egyptians see you, they will say, this is his wife. Then they will kill me, but they will let you live. Verse 13, say you are my sister, that it may go well with me because of you, and that my life may be spared for your sake. Now, I feel like that was a backhanded compliment. He said, you are stunning, and when we get into Egypt, Pharaoh and all the household of Pharaoh and all the Egyptians are going to see how attractive and stunning and beautiful you are. And they're going to go, man, she's married to this guy. Let's kill this guy so we can take her as a wife. You know, again, I hate to keep repeating this, but God had already made promises that there would be a land, a nation, and a blessing that would all come through Abram. So my question to you is it possible that Abram in any way could have been killed? Yes or no? No. Based in God's promises, the unconditional promises that God made to Abraham, it's impossible for God to lie, and God will always keep his promises. So when Abram says to Sarai, hey, listen, you're stunning. When we go into this place, they're going to see that you're stunning, you're attractive, you're a beautiful woman, and they're going to say, this guy here is married to her. We want her as a wife, or we want her in our harem. So just go ahead and lie. And really, this was a half-truth, because Sarai was Abram's half-sister. Now, we're not going to get too far into that. Some of you are like, whoa, can we back up the bus and talk about this? My answer to that is no, not today. We're not going to talk about that too much. We could go back to Adam and Eve and their children and ask, well, like who in the beginning, who married who, like it was only brothers, sisters type thing. We're not going back there right now, but just put that in the back of your mind. And Jeff will be speaking next week, and you can ask him those questions, okay? So it was a half-truth. They had the same father, but not the same mother. Yet this half-truth was a whole lie. Abraham's intent here was clearly to deceive. And he trusted in his deception to protect him instead of trusting in the Lord. How? And again, we do this so much. We hide behind spiritual lies. We think that we're just trying to protect God's promises. God has promised this, so I need to kind of create my own way. I need to make sure that God doesn't look bad here. So I'll do my best to manipulate outcomes. I'll try my best to control the situation to make sure that what God promised to do, that those things can come to pass. And do you realize that every time that we do that, what are we saying? I trust more in myself than I do with putting my circumstances in God's hands. Now, we're not saying that out loud because we're too spiritual to do that. But in our minds, when we choose to manipulate and control and keep our hands on circumstances to make sure that God doesn't look bad, that's a problem. Because God, as creator, as sovereign, is fully capable of taking care and keeping the promises that he has made. He did not need Abram's half-truth. He didn't need his lie. But what happens? Abram knew long-term, God will do this. But short-term, he was like, the circumstances aren't looking real good right now. There's a famine. My wife's attractive. I'm going to get outed when I go into Egypt. So we need to do something. And it really goes back to this, is that when God said that Canaan is going to be yours, it wasn't his yet. They didn't own anything there. The Abram, in the place that he was at, even though it was a tough circumstance, that there was a famine there, that's where God called him to, so he should have stayed, trusted that God would provide. But instead, he didn't. He headed down to Egypt. It created more problems, more lies, more deception. You see, I think that you can identify with that too. Because how is it when you're reading through the scriptures, by the way, which is the way that God speaks to us is through the scriptures, and when God makes a clear promise to you. Now, I think we always need to be careful when we're reading the scripture to know to whom God is making a promise. There are promises, especially as we look in the Old Testament, that are made to a nation or a specific person. And we always need to be careful when God has made a promise to a specific person or a nation or during a season that we cannot claim that promise as our own. Now, I will agree that sometimes God's character comes out in those promises he makes to individuals and nations, but we need to be careful about claiming a specific promise for our own unless it's based or rooted in God's character. So considering God's promises to Abraham, there was no need to fear that Pharaoh or anyone in Egypt could harm them. God can be trusted to keep his promises. Can I just take a really simple thing? Some of you have hang-ups with God's forgiveness. God has been extremely clear that if you, 1 John 1:9, if you confess your sin, God is faithful and just to forgive you of your sin and to cleanse you from all unrighteousness. That's a promise. Now, it's conditional, because if you don't confess, then God doesn't forgive. But it says if you confess your sin, that God is faithful and just to forgive sin and to cleanse you from all unrighteousness. And some of you sitting here today, you have a hard time believing that. You do. There are things that you look back on, maybe it was this weekend or last week or a decade ago that you've done, that you've said, you've confessed those things to God. You've acknowledged that they're sinful. You made things, if you need to, you've made things right with another person, but you still live with the shame and guilt of that sin. And I'm not here trying to say that there aren't consequences to our sin, because there absolutely are. But God has promised to cleanse us from sin when we confess. That's a promise he's made to us. And if you're sitting in here today and you're still beating yourself up over something that you did 10 years ago that you made right with God, that you confessed to God, you know what that is? It's a lack of trust in his promises. If God says, I will do this, anything but trust in him is a deceitfulness in our own hearts. Even for things like rescue from sin through Christ on the cross. There's some of you in this room that you struggle with how could God forgive someone like me and allow me to enter into a relationship with God the Father through the work of Jesus Christ. But Scripture clearly teaches that forgiveness of sin in eternal life is not based in the works that you do. Because the penalty for sin is what? It's death every time. So no matter how many good works you choose to do in your life, they will never pay the consequence of sin, which is ultimately death. And so therefore, God made a way for you to have a relationship with him. And that is not by trying to do better with your life or trying to do good works or hoping that one day when you stand before God, when he looks at your good works and bad works, he's like, oh man, your good works are more than your bad works, so enter into eternal life. No, that's not the way it works. But instead, God provided a sacrifice, one who is a substitute, who paid the penalty for our sins on our behalf, and that was his son, Jesus. The death that you deserve and I deserve for my sin was taken by Christ on the cross. His death for ours. So my question for some of you is, can you trust God to keep his promises? Can you trust that God the Father, through his son Jesus, provided forgiveness of sin for you without any effort of your own? That's a promise he's made. Well, how did this story with Abram's lie end? Verse 14. It says, when Abram entered Egypt, the Egyptians saw that the woman was very beautiful. So exactly what Abram thought would happen, it did happen. That's how it is in life, right? Sometimes these things that we think happen, they do happen. Not all the time, but exactly what Abram feared had happened. Verse 15, and when the princes of Pharaoh saw her, they praised her to Pharaoh. I mean, she must have been an absolute sight. I think around this time she would have been 60 years old. It says, and the woman was taken into Pharaoh's house, verse 16, and for her sake, he, speaking of Pharaoh, dealt well with Abram. So because of this half lie, instead of Sarah saying, oh yeah, I'm married to Abram, she said, oh, we're brother and sister. Here's what happens, and this is crazy. Verse 16, and for her sake, he dealt well with Abram. So instead of killing Abram, he dealt well because he's like, oh, well, this is her brother. And look at how Abram benefited from deception and lies. It says, and he had sheep, oxen, male donkeys, male servants, female donkeys, and camels. Abram believed the path to the good life was through his own deception rather than God's design. The same danger faces us today. We are pulled to pretend for our provision. We believe that lies will control outcomes. So what happens? Verse 17. But the Lord afflicted Pharaoh and his house with great plagues because of Sarai, Abram's wife. Now, why do you think this is? Why do you think that Pharaoh's house was plagued because he had taken in Sarah? Why do you think that was? Because of God's promises. God's promises for a land, a nation, and a blessing. And that land and that nation and that blessing would not come through Abram's deception or Sarah's deception, but instead it would come through the way that God orchestrated. Well, verse 18, it's like if you remember back to your childhood, when you've done something wrong and you get caught on the carpet, that's what my dad used to call it, getting caught on the carpet for something. Well, that's what happens to Abram. Now, I'm not sure how Pharaoh found out that Abram was lying to him, but in some way, it could have been a dream. God could have appeared to Pharaoh in a dream, let him know. Somebody could have told Pharaoh, hey, this is what's really going on. It says, verse 18, so Pharaoh called Abram and said, what is this you have done to me? ? I'm sure his voice was probably a little bit more loud than that. Why did you not tell me that she was your wife? Imagine this is a pagan king, one who worshiped many gods, calling out someone who is supposed to be a true worshiper of the Lord. It's like, what were you thinking? Why didn't you just tell the truth? He says, why did you say she's my sister? So that I took her for my wife. And this is what he says. Now then, here's your wife, take her and go. Get out of here. Verse 20, and Pharaoh gave men orders concerning him, and they sent him away with his wife and all he had. So God intervened. Again, Abram's like the long-term purposes, the land, the nation, the blessing, but it sure doesn't look like it in the short term. We got a famine going on. I'm likely gonna maybe lose my life because they think my wife is hot. So I need to do some stuff to manipulate the situation here. And it leads me to say this. Others pay the price when we choose to live independent of God. I'm not saying that Pharaoh and Pharaoh's household were some saints. They weren't. But because of Abram's lie and deception, they paid the price. But even think beyond that. I don't know if you've thought about this, but what kind of a husband would, in a sense, just throw his wife to the quote unquote wolves? It's like, hey, I'm kind of worried about protecting my own life here, so I need you to say that you're my sister, and if they want to take you as wife, just go ahead, you know? Imagine that. Now, I'm assuming that Sarai was a strong woman. I'm not questioning that whatsoever. But others paid the price because Abram failed to trust the short-term circumstances into God's hands. Abraham has not yet learned to fully trust in God's plan and promises, at least in a way that affected his actions. But here's what's really crazy to me. Abraham still receives the provision and protection for which he is searching. Why? Because despite Abraham's desire to live independent of God's plan, God remains faithful to his promises. Let me say it like this. God is faithful to his promises even when you are not. My question to you and myself this morning is this. Will you trust God even in your hardships and not turn to deceit or maybe even change direction to control outcomes? Realize that there are long-term promises that God has made to us in the scriptures. But let's not be a people that freaks out when the short-term circumstances that we're experiencing or going through don't match up with where we're headed. So I want to leave you with that thought today. What are you going through right now? What are the short-term circumstances that you're experiencing? Are you running from that? Are you tempted to just up and leave everything? Or will you say, God, right now, I don't see how you're going to work through this. The answers are they're not really here right now. I know what you've said long term. I know what awaits me. I know what promises you've made. But God, right now, it doesn't really seem like we're getting there. It seems like we kind of took a detour. In fact, it seems like we're going the other way. So my question to you and to myself this morning is, I pray that we know long term what God has promised to us. But in the short term, in these short-term circumstances, difficulties, hardships, let's not lose sight of what God has promised and mostly who he is and what he'll do.